The future of the auto industry is increasingly electric and connected. And so to remain competitive and to realize our potential, we must develop the entire value chain for next generation vehicles.
Mark Carney there on his new auto strategy. What is the government signaling with the strategy? Will it be enough to protect Canadian auto jobs? Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum. Tonda MacCharles is the Ottawa bureau chief for the Toronto Star. Wherry is a senior writer for CBC News. And Emilie Nicolas is a columnist for Le Devoir, and she's in Montreal. Tonda, I'm going to start with you. I found the Oshawa mayor very compelling because of the auto sector. It's not just about jobs. It's also sort of, what defines communities, his city, and some people's lives. So it's necessary that there be some sort of pivot or change. What do you think that strategy told us about where the government thinks things are headed?
I think it gives, for those who want to read it, completely a big indication that Mark Carney is all in on EVs being the future of the industry. And he is making a call out to companies and other political leaders as well to recognize that transition is necessary. So he's brought back rebates to incentivize consumers. He's all in on helping the companies make the transition. But I think, it's also a big signal because he's promised to revisit how Canada penalizes, for example, the American big three car makers for not doing production in Canada. He's promised to take a big, hard look at all of that. So fundamentally, Mark Carney is placing a big bet, hedging against the U.S. trade talks ever coming out in our favor, and pivoting towards where the rest of the world he sees is going, be it the EU, Japan, Korea, China. That's where he wants to position the industry. But he has dialed back a bunch of climate policies that the car industry itself was saying is impinging any progress.
And what do you make of that hedge, Aaron? Because I think that's a good way to characterize it.
Yeah, look, I think when there was the initial sort of leak of the news that they were going to be walking away from the EV mandate, it looked kind of bleak for the climate policy file. I think in the end analysis, this isn't quite the step back that it might have seemed like. I think the EV mandate had a purpose. It was there to ensure supply of EVs for people who wanted to buy them. Would have meant, meaningful emissions reductions as well, of course. But I think the policies they've landed on have sort of shored up the climate policy for the Carney government. It's not quite, yes, the headline, I guess, is that they're walking away from a Trudeau era policy, but in total, I think it's still casting the way forward for a big focus on EVs, which is where China and Europe and the rest of the world, excluding the United States, are headed. And so I think, Mark Carney has sort of shored up his climate policy on that regard. I think it is as well an acknowledgement that, to quote the Oshawa mayor, being, optimistic but pessimistic. I think, you live in hope that there can be some kind of peace on the trade front, but you can't really plan on that at this point. And I think when you look at the policy in terms of both EVs, in terms of, manufacturing writ large, it really is built, I think, on the idea that you can't really rely on working necessarily in tandem with the United States on this.
Well, Emilie, I mean, you talk about the U.S., but also about the climate policy, because it was not met with an enormous amount of outrage, I will say, from a lot of climate activists. There were some, but a lot of people thought it was, fairly okay, acceptable. What do you make of what it told us about Mark Carney's approach to climate change?
Well, when it comes to the climate activism perspective, first of all, the first thing that's always important to understand is that EV is not going to save the planet, in the sense that it really is a shift to collective transportation and a different kind of urbanization that's going to do it. And so that's not what this policy is about. So there's always bound to be a certain amount of criticism. The other thing as well, when it comes to Mark Carney's approach that could be criticized from climate concern perspective, is the fact that they're moving away from regulation and the infamous now carbon tax to the idea of energy efficiency. The the gap in that, and then we've seen that in the last, 20, 30 years, is that as cars get quote unquote more energy efficient, Canadians just buy bigger cars. And we've seen it with the pandemic of SUVs on the roads that are heavier now than ever, creating potholes in Montreal in a historical level, taking more parking space in downtown areas. And so that at the end of the day, when you have cars that are sold to people or celebrated as energy efficient, people just find that's the wheel of capitalism. Just like they just invent themselves more need to have bigger and bigger cars. And so the family car that we have in 2026 has nothing to do with the family cars people had in the 90s when when cars were not as energy efficient. And so that seems to be what Mark Carney is banking on in terms of measurement of what is a great car. And that allows car companies to just sell us bigger car because they're going to be more energy efficient. And we still haven't cracked the nut in terms of how to get ourselves out of that addiction to just basically everybody driving trucks around Canada.
Well, some of that is probably to do with the weather as well. When I think about the car my parents were driving me around in when I was small. Tonda, to go back to Donald Trump, is this a way to, certainly it's a way to try and protect the auto industry from Trump, but is it something that could potentially cause us problems as well? If we are we're not shutting off the big three, but we're clearly turning away from this idea that this is the path forward necessarily.
Look, how will it affect things at the renegotiation table around the trade pact? That I don't know. But I think that this is a very clear signal that the Carney government is placing its bet on a different industry, including different industry partners. They are fond of pointing out to us that in the 40 years that the Japanese car makers Honda and Toyota were admitted to Canada, there have been no massive layoffs. But in that same time period, the big three automakers based in the US who have production in Canada repeatedly lay off Canadian workers whenever it suits their purposes. And I think that what you see in this strategy is a move by the Carney government to say enough and to bring in a different, we haven't seen what this tradable credits program is going to look like, but it's another tool that they're hoping to craft to tell the big three automakers that if you're leaving Canada, you will pay a penalty. If you're leaving production, you're moving out, you will pay a penalty. Let's see what that looks like. But there's no question that this U.S. administration does not like what Canada is doing in terms of looking to China, giving China even a small opening into the auto market here. And is that going to be an irritant in the bigger picture? Yes. How it plays out at the table, will Carney be able to make the argument, as he has to Doug Ford and others, that it's just a small toehold and they're not going to be eligible if you buy one of these very nice, sleek Chinese EVs, I've got to say. If you buy one of them, you don't get the rebate. And there's no cap on the price of an EV car if it's made in Canada for the rebates. There is on a European model that's up to $50,000. You'll get a rebate. Beyond that, you don't. So look, he's signaling the U.S. big time. He's signaling the big U.S. car makers big time. Will they read it in the way he wants them to? I don't know.
In the past year, Canada has faced a challenge unique in our lifetimes: a hostile United States. One that has openly questioned Canadian sovereignty, that has openly broken the trade commitments that we have made to each other, and that regularly issues further threats against us. To be clear, these realities mean that we must reduce our dependence on the U.S. in order to protect our sovereignty and our economy.
Former Prime Minister Stephen Harper with some rare public commentary about how Canada should proceed in its relationship with the Trump administration amidst new realities. Do his comments back up what Prime Minister Carney has been doing? Could it push the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, to take a stronger position on how he would deal with things if he was Prime Minister? Let's bring back our Sunday Scrum. Tonda MacCharles, the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Wherry, Senior Writer for CBC, also here in Ottawa. Emilie Nicolas, a columnist for Le Devoir in Montreal. I will say that Ottawa this past week was sort of like in a bit of a time warp if you walked around downtown, because you kept seeing all these people from the Harper era celebrating 28 years since Harper won, and obviously the unveiling of his portrait. But Aaron, it was those words, I think, that got a lot of people's attention, in part because Stephen Harper doesn't talk that often, frankly, to a domestic audience anyway. How did you read his comments and how they sort of play into the political moment we're in?
So first, I think it's important that a former prime minister, a conservative prime minister, spoke with that much clarity about the situation that Canada faces at this moment. I thought his remarks about, some people, particularly in the business community, sort of hoping that things will snap back, that being, not a safe bet. I thought that was important for him to say. In terms of his sort of broader call for unity, particularly across the two major parties, I think, again, it's important for a prime minister, a former prime minister, to say that, some things are beyond the partisan competition for power and for electoral victory, particularly a prime minister who, with full respect to him, was not, immune to partisan competition and battle. I think it will be interesting to see what that could mean in practice. Or I guess the next question would be what that means in practice. I don't know that it means the parties are suddenly going to agree on everything, or that the Conservatives are suddenly going to down tools and not oppose things. But I do think it is an important kind of idea to have, that when it comes right down to it, in terms of the dealing with the United States, in terms of dealing with the internal pressures that we could be seeing in Alberta and Quebec, that, angling for partisan advantage isn't as important as holding the country together and defending it from an external threat. And I think it will be useful, I guess, for everyone in the political arena to sort of have that in the back of their minds going forward.
What did you make of the comment, Emilie? It was certainly something just to hear from him on these issues, because he doesn't do a lot of sort of backseat driving on policy and politics. What did you make of the comment?
First of all, he's the only man in Canada who could do that. There's no other Conservative prime minister. There's no other non-Liberal prime minister still around. And he's definitely the only prime minister from Alberta as well, which is a very specific place to be from, making those.
Yeah, Joe Clark is around, but it was a progressive.
Kim Campbell.
Yeah, but he's not.
Kim Campbell.
You're right. But they're not being active. They haven't been making public comments in ages. But you're absolutely right. I'm sorry about that. But still, there is that issue of. It's a very, very rare position for him to be speaking from. There is also the issue, I think, beyond the Conservative Party itself. I think the issue is really Canadian MAGA, and how far it is already entrenched in some part of the country, how hard it is still for us to name that it played a role in the occupation of Ottawa. And how it is playing a role in Alberta separatism, and that even with Pierre Poilievre's best effort, it is playing a role in part of his base and making it harder for him to take certain policy stances without having to deal with part of his base. And that isn't something that is within Canadian control. That is very much the result of years of online influence, if not interference, from American influencers and American TV channels that are heavily listened to in certain part of the country. And it has created an ideological proximity based as well on language and cultural proximities that are hard to ignore, and that are making it harder for Conservative leaders, regardless of their personal qualities, to keep everyone on the right aligned with basic patriotism. And I think it's really helpful that Stephen Harper is doing that. But I think that's the issue. And so God knows I can be the first one to criticize Pierre Poilievre when I want to, and that needs to be done. But I think we also need to acknowledge that, let's call them patriotic Conservatives, are often in a rock in a hard place, more and more on certain issues. And they are trying to find solutions to keep everyone aligned so that there isn't a blowback when Pierre Poilievre says invading Greenland is bad.
Yeah.
And that is the issue that we're facing now.
You wrote a really smart piece, I thought, Tonda, this week about sort of Mark Carney and Stephen Harper. And I wonder what you think Stephen Harper's language and comments mean for him as Prime Minister, whether they help him in some way.
I was struck by the message that Harper gave, obviously, to the business community and to the government in opposition to cooperate. I was also very struck by the message that he sent to the government side, which is he said that, yes, the opposition has to set aside constant opposition to everything and cooperate on the big things like Canadian sovereignty. But he said to both leaders, Carney and Poilievre, cooperate when it comes to domestic policies that threaten unity. And he also said to the government on his Monday appearance when he got the gold medal at the Royal Canadian Geographic Society, that the opposition should support the government on a number of things, those big things, but the government should not then exploit the opposition's support to disadvantage it politically and to advantage the government. And that was very much saying to Mark Carney and his Liberal caucus, if you want support and you want cooperation, then when they offer it and give it, accept it, but don't rub their faces in it. Don't use it then to besmirch the leader and goad them and say, oh, well, you're agreeing with everything we're doing. And I think that's an important political message that also can feed, if they're all sincere about wanting to cooperate on these big questions right now, that's a message that needed to be heard.
Yeah, I don't doubt their sincerity. I don't think any of us would. I doubt their ability to do it a little bit, I think.
Political
Erin.
pressures, right?
Yeah. And that kind of speaks to the moment. And Emilie, you're sort of talking about it. Like, it is very hard right now to both criticize the government and sort of stand up for the country. That is a hard position. When I talked to Conservatives about it last weekend, they said that is a demonstration of the strength of our democracy, which they're absolutely right. But that sort of puts to how complicated a moment we are in, Aaron.
Yeah, I think it's always easy to call for bipartisanship. It's harder to explain exactly what that should look like.
Yeah.
Particularly in a parliamentary system that has an official opposition. I think I think if there's a piece of this sort of beyond the mechanics of Parliament and how politics is going to work going forward, it's for Pierre Poilievre, I think, in terms of, I don't know that we've necessarily heard from him exactly how he sees the American relationship at this point and how he sees it moving forward. And I think that's one of the things that seemed to stand out about Harper's remarks, is that you hadn't heard something like that from Pierre Poilievre. And I think, which is not to say that he should stop talking about housing or grocery prices or all these things that are very important. But I think, we've heard Mark Carney say, the old relationship is over. This is a rupture, not a transition, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know that we've heard that from Pierre Poilievre. And I think that is, there's lots of discussion about how he should engage with Donald Trump and whether he should, say his name more often, for instance. I think what's missing at this point is a real sense of where Pierre Poilievre sees the relationship going forward, whether he agrees with Mark Carney's take or whether he sees, something different than what Mark Carney sees.
Yeah, we are told that he will have more to say about Donald Trump. That was part of what came out of that convention. Emilie, 20 seconds to you on what you would expect to hear from Pierre Poilievre.
I think we had the test last week when someone from the White House went on Fox News and said that Mark Carney had walked back his Davos comments and some of the Conservative Party bit at the debate, essentially. Yeah. We need to have a stronger immune system in terms of when the White House is trying to have discord in Canada, that we cannot use that as partisan attack. And so that's what I'm expecting from Pierre Poilievre in the future, to know the difference between critics that is coming from within Canada and parroting the White House lies.
Emilie Nicolas, Wherry, Tonda MacCharles, thank you for spending part of your Sunday with me. Appreciate it.
Thanks.